NATO has pledged to ramp up defense spending in line with demands by the US president. But a possible Spain exemption could threaten hope of a united stance. Our divisions are a consistent theme in a bloc as large as 32, which NATO is, especially over the war in Ukraine. CNA's Genevieve finds out the impact of tension between Washington and its European allies.
The attitude of US President Donald Trump towards the Russia-Ukraine war has been sharply at odds with America's allies in Europe. This family photo of leading European nations and Canada rallying behind Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is what NATO looks like without the US. America's relationship with the EU was further strained when Mr. Trump and his team gave Mr. Zelensky a dressing down at the White House. Is the world's largest peacetime military alliance at risk? Before we consider the possibility and consequences of NATO without the US, let's take a step back and ask, what is NATO and what is the US role in NATO? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a military alliance comprising the US, Canada, and European nations. It was formed in Washington, D.C. in April 1949. With the US and Canada as the chief architects and 12 founding member countries in Europe, including Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the UK. Over the past 76 years, NATO has expanded. Today, the alliance has 32 members, and its headquarters is in Brussels, chosen for its strategic central location in Europe. Why was NATO formed in 1949? It is a defensive nuclear alliance under the leadership of the US in post-war Europe.
And the Soviet Union emerged as a very powerful country at the end of the Cold War. The United States believed that the best way to deal with a strong resurgent Soviet Union was to try and get as many European allies as possible.
As the first Secretary General of the alliance, Lord Izmy, put it, NATO's role is to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Its inception has to be understood against the background of the post-war situation in Europe, where you had an increasing sense that the Soviet Union was intent on expanding to the West and subjugating more and more countries to its imperialist dominance.
What is the NATO doctrine? There are 14 articles in the NATO treaty. Article 5 sums up the core of the alliance, that an attack against one ally is an attack against all. It is a promise of collective defense.
Article 5 is what keeps Europe secure. The United States continues to play a central role in the alliance, thanks to the size of its military, thanks to the size of its nuclear deterrent, thanks to its intelligence and logistics, etc., etc. But it's also a vehicle that enables the United States to project power internationally in Europe and beyond.
The US provides troops, ammunition, and military bases across continental Europe. America's nuclear weapons are seen as extending deterrence to all NATO members.
Well, it is obviously the nuclear umbrella, whereas France and the UK have their own nuclear deterrents. They don't quite have the same capabilities and the same kind of full escalation ladder that the US brings to the table, which is arguably necessary to provide a backstop in the case of a conflict with a country such as Russia or China.
The first Supreme Allied Commander for Europe was General Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1951, who later became the 34th US President. This position has always been held by an American since Eisenhower. The current Supreme Allied Commander is General Christopher G. Carvioli of the US Army. What are some of America's largest contributions to NATO?
You give Europe a tremendous sense of security that they have the mighty United States backing them against this very strong and powerful Soviet Union. And of course, the United States was carrying out a strategy that the United States should go for the containment of the Soviet Union. And that containment policy was remarkably successful because at the end of the Cold War, it basically led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
If the US does pull out of NATO, who might be the biggest winners and losers in such a scenario?
It is important to remember that a demise of NATO or its turn into something irrelevant would really come to bite the United States as well. I mean, the United States has military bases in Europe, has operated airports, logistical centers, and those serve not only in maintaining a favorable balance of power in Europe, but it also helped the United States to project power in the Middle East, in the Red Sea, even arguably in the Indo-Pacific.
I think without a NATO, clearly the biggest winner will be Russia, because Russia will be much, much stronger individually than any of the European countries. If President Donald Trump pulls the United States out of NATO, there'll be no NATO left.
Professor, you have recently recommended that Europe should exit NATO. Why did you propose that idea?
If he spends more than 5% of his GNP on defense, Europe doesn't need NATO. It'll be powerful enough. You know, Donald Trump keeps on threatening Europe, and the Europeans are so scared that they dare not reply robustly. All they have to do is stand up and tell President Donald Trump, thank you very much for your strong support over the years. Now we will take care of ourselves. We will leave NATO. And if they were to say that, the Americans will come rushing back to say, hey, no, please don't leave. Please don't leave. It's like playing a game of poker. Sometimes you have to bluff.
If you were a betting man, Prof, do you think the US will pull out of NATO?
Well, I think one has to make a distinction between a formal decision to leave NATO, which I don't think he will do, because it requires to some extent congressional approval, but there can also be an informal decision to give NATO much less priority and much less importance. And the second can be just as damaging to the Europeans.
I don't think the United States will pull out of NATO in the second Trump term or in the foreseeable future at large, but I think we are running a real risk of a US disengagement from Europe. I think we are in for a fraught couple of years, really, and I think it will be important for Europeans to step up to this challenge and act, truly responsibly and take their own security seriously.
The expert consensus seems to be that Donald Trump will not pull the US out of NATO at this point. However, his message that America has been shouldering the world's security burdens is loud and clear. He wants European allies to cough up more for defense spending. And perhaps this message has landed. The UK, Germany, Poland and Denmark have announced higher military budgets, while the EU has presented a plan to increase defense spending by 800 billion euros to shore up support for Ukraine. And that might just stave off the mercurial US president's musings on a NATO without America for now.